Now, talk about transformation. Jal Mehta's work embodies the term. Today, he will help us visualize how the pandemic created the opportunity to reimagine the century-old notion of schooling. He'll explore and share processes for how innovative schools have reconceived time, assessment, curriculum, relationships, and more to foster powerful change, deep and equitable learning for all students. Dr. Mehta is professor of education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. A sociologist by training, his work focuses on how to remake the industrial-era school system into a modern learning organization that creates purpose and passion for both students and adults. He's the author, most recently with Sarah Fine, of In Search of Deeper Learning, The Quest to Remake the American High School. Mehta is the co-director of the Deeper Learning Dozen, a community of practice of 12 districts across the United States and Canada that are seeking to remake themselves for the future. He works with teachers, schools, districts, and states in the United States and around the world, seeking to cull wisdom from leading practitioners and share it with the field. Mehta is also the proud recipient of the Morningstar Teaching Award at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dr. Mehta is open and curious, genuinely interested in new ideas and others' perspectives. He also consistently brings the theoretical back to the real world, using the experiences he has of an observer in classrooms and as a parent into his vision for how the education system could better serve students. Jal skillfully balances an encyclopedic knowledge of theories and research with an understanding of the real world of students' lives, and then speaks and writes about these issues incredibly clearly. He's been a great thought partner and a generous collaborator with Learning Forward. We love that he's fun to work with, he's down to earth, and he has a great sense of humor. It is with great admiration that I introduce Dr. Jal Mehta.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I will see if I can live up to it. I'm really looking forward to this presentation and conversation today. I'm going to talk for about 35 minutes, and then we will have a chance to do some Q&A. All right. All right, so today I want to talk about a theme which is really dear to my heart, making schools more human. Amplify, hospice, and create. So you could think of the situation we're in right now as there are kind of two dominant paradigms for how people are thinking about what we should be doing this year. The first one is what you might think of as status quo return. It's been a very difficult 2 years, obviously, for parents, students, teachers, and everybody else. And, you know, how soon can we get back to normal? We hear a lot of that. And then the second one is this narrative around learning loss. Lots of kids have lost dominant academic disciplinary knowledge during the pandemic, while they may have gained lots of other things. And so, like, our main goal for this year and next year should be to quote unquote catch them up. And I'm going to suggest that neither of those narratives really captures what we should be trying to do with students and in schools, and instead make an argument for this third option, which I'm calling humane reinvention. So over the next half an hour or so, I'm going to sort of sketch what this third possibility looks like. I should say that you know, when you give talks, sometimes people invite you to give a talk and you sort of smush together what you know with what they're asking for and give a talk. This is not one of those situations. This is a situation where I think we are really not on the right path in a lot of places. It's causing a lot of unhappiness among teachers and students, and there are better things that we could be doing, that some schools are doing, that some districts are doing. And so I really think of this as kind of an urgent message from wise practitioners in the field to the rest of us. All right. So there's a pattern of change which Peggy Holman writes about in her book, Engaging Emergence. And essentially she says that, you know, there's some kind of equilibrium, which you might think of as coherence, and then there's disruption. And then what that disruption produces is differentiation, that when there's disruption, lots of people try out lots of different things. And then the job of leaders is to look at that differentiation and then cull the best of what has emerged and use that as the basis for creating a new coherence. And that was essentially the thought behind a project that Justin Reich at MIT and I did around this idea of amplify, hospice, and create. And so essentially the idea was, rather than looking at the last couple of years through a deficit framework, COVID-19 and other pandemics we've had, pandemic around racial inequality and others, have created this disruption. And so then the questions are, amplify, what do we want to keep or grow? What has emerged during the pandemic that we can learn from and that we might want to grow back as we re-enter more full-time school? Hospice, what do we want to let go of? What is no one asking to return to? And then create, what new things do we need? How can we realize the best things of the previous year in this new environment? I was talking to my dad and he said, Joe, what's your latest half utopian idea for schools? And I told him about Amplify, Hospice, and Create. And he said, that's actually, really sensible. You're basically saying, keep what works and let go of what doesn't work. So it has been endorsed by my dad, who, as you can see, is sometimes skeptical of some of the things that I say. I should also say that for folks for whom hospice is a difficult word, I understand that, but hospice comes from Margaret Wheatley and other people who've written about this in the emergence literature. And I think it's intentionally meant to be kind of a hard word. It's sort of saying there are elements of our school system that were born a long time ago, and we really need to let go of those things. And it may be painful, but it's part of the process of sort of growth and reemergence. Okay, so what did we do? Justin and I ran 10 design charrettes over the spring and summer with leading practitioners. We had teachers interview their students. So we put out a call through our networks for teachers to interview students with some questions, which I'll share in a little bit, in advisories and other classes that they were doing with teachers. And then we did 50 interviews with teachers ourselves. And what emerged from some of this? So here's one point. If any theme unites student experience, it is the profound sense of loss of social connections to their peers. They missed clubs, sports, field trips, and transition events. Students in schools with narrow grade bands, like a 7th and 8th grade middle school, missed practically their entire school experience. They missed their friends. One wrote, online school has made me more of an introvert, hard to make friends and socialize with people, want to stay in my house and not go outside. Not every student felt this way. A few suggested how much they enjoyed being away from the social pressures of school. And students warned us, please don't be like, quote, they missed so much social interaction. Let's give them a bunch of awkward conversation starters to create friendships. Students, as always, keeping it real. Students talked about lost connections and growing autonomy. So here's a quote from a teacher paraphrasing some of the things she saw from students. Our school days started at a time that is developmentally wildly inappropriate, but remote school has allowed us to change that and to push it and say, we don't have to make you get up at 5:30 in the morning to take 2 trains to get to school in time for 7:30 breakfast. We don't have to do that. I think there's a way in which this moment has revealed to kids the way in which our school system is really dehumanizing. Kids talked about being able to go to the bathroom when they want to, instead of when they're told yes or no by an adult. They talk about being able to eat a snack. Like, why are we controlling them? Why are schools places when you can't eat when you're hungry, or you can't go to the bathroom where you need to, or we're telling you what clothes you can and can't wear? And I would say, as a teacher, I've been thinking a lot about why are our schools set up this way? And so this quote, we got this quote from this teacher late last spring, but I think if you look at what's been happening this year, it's been a very hard year. There's been a lot of kids doing what might be described as acting out. There have been fights in schools. There have been kids who are physically present, but whose attention isn't there. And I think in a way, part of what the teachers were telling us and the students were telling us is that being at home was in some ways a sort of more human environment, a world where they lost social connections, yes, but their autonomy was growing. And then being put back into the school environment, they appreciated being able to see their friends, but the way in which they were being put back into an institutionalized setting was really, has been really grating on them. So then we asked teachers, okay, well, what did you learn from this that you want to carry forward? And two themes that emerged with some consistency are the need to emphasize relationships and the desire to build on students' newfound sense of autonomy. One teacher said, I need to make so much more space for connecting with students, for students to learn about each other. I have to stop thinking of community building as one unit at the beginning that I rush through, and how community can play a larger, more systematic role in the classroom. One teacher suggested that adults need to be compassionate about how young people are managed, celebrate their resilience in managing stress, and work collaboratively with them to figure out how to transition helpful coping skills into their lives moving forward. Teachers were closest to the issue, but they felt misunderstood by principals and districts. I'm healing from being in a toxic relationship with my principal and district. I expect to. I've been out of my district for about a month now in a new role, new job, new career for almost 3 weeks. So that's allowed me to heal or begin the process of healing. I'm in a work environment, for example, where I'm not questioned and my expertise is assumed. I don't feel I'm handcuffed in any way, but because I'm still healing, because teaching was such a big part of my life and my identity for almost 22 years, I don't know that I have the joy that I once did teaching, but I don't know if that's because of the new non-teaching role or if it's because I'm out, says Vanessa, a 4th grade math teacher. All right, so then in the student interviews, what did the students say? The students said, one thing that was really interesting that we didn't necessarily expect is a lot of students' comments were less about COVID and more about pre-existing inequities that existed in the school system. So there were a lot of complaints about funding, quality of facilities, quality of food, lack of relevance, agency, authenticity to their learning. They talked about those things more than they talked about COVID when we coded our notes. They said they did not feel like they'd missed a year of school. That's CAP in the latest lingo. And so to the degree that things were pitched this year as making up school that was missed last year, that may be objectively true, but subjectively, students felt like they were really giving it their best shot last year. Okay, so we put some of this into a table, a sort of Amplify Hospice Create table. I won't share all of it, but I'll share maybe 6 of the rows. So one of the themes was around trust and relationships. Some of the things that our leading practitioners said that they wanted to amplify were home visits that built relationships between home and school, advisories, Zoom-style chat, and virtual meetings. So they said being able to talk to parents online and have meetings that way was more convenient and allowed for much more parent-teacher contact. They said that during the pandemic, because students experienced lost motivation and loss of morale, there was a lot more one-on-one checking in with students, and that was something that they wanted to hold on to when they went back to sort of quote unquote more regular school. In terms of things that they wanted to hospice, let go of, they wanted to let go of rushing through content and having transactional relationships with students. Some shyer students had really thrived through Google Meet or Zoom chat, ways of connecting with teachers that didn't require them to voice their thoughts. And so teachers said, when we're sitting with them physically, is there a way that we could get the quieter students' thoughts? Could we come up with multiple ways of understanding what they were saying as opposed to just relying on them making oral comments? And then in terms of things to create, more shared power and collective decision-making, creating multiple modalities for shared learning, and trying to differentiate between what sorts of meetings have to happen in person and what sorts of meetings could happen virtually. Another really interesting thing that happened in the pandemic had to do with scheduling and time. So some of the schools in our networks moved to a quarter system, where instead of taking 6 or 7 classes over a semester, students took 3 classes a quarter in middle schools or high schools. They did this for COVID reasons initially, because it meant fewer contacts with fewer different teachers. But they discovered that what that did was it allowed those classes to run for longer periods of time, which enabled for more depth in the work and deeper relationships between the teachers and the students, because if you're teaching, if there's 3 classes going on at a time as opposed to 6 or 7, that means that the teacher load is essentially cut by half. So over the course of like a semester, you would still be seeing the same number of students, but at any given time, you're only seeing half of those students, and that makes it much more possible to build relationships with those students. Another theme, this one started to emerge in summer 2020, the first time we did this project. Someone in one of our design charrettes said, you know, we really need to Marie Kondo the curriculum, taking after the Japanese tidying expert who says that you should throw out all items that don't spark joy in your life. And that turned out to be a really, really generative suggestion that especially this year, I think the Marie Kondo theme is doubly important because everyone is feeling radically overburdened. And so rather than trying to sort of rush through all of the things you're trying to do, a good question is like, what can be cut? What can reasonably be accomplished, which creates more space and air in the system. In terms of SEL and self-care, that was another big theme of some things that happened during the pandemic, more mindfulness practices, more check-ins with students, again, to hospice, rushing through content. You might hospice mandated SEL workshops. A friend of mine who's a teacher put up a tweet which said, time for self-care greater than mandated workshop on self-care. And I thought that was pretty apropos. So some schools have done this as sort of restorative restart at the beginning of this year, but building in those kind of communities across the whole year, ongoing space for mental health. One of the things that went really well during the beginning of the pandemic was this sort of enlarged sense of what it meant to be responsible for students and families. So lots of schools and districts spent time feeding students, setting up distribution so that students could get meals. Some schools reached out to see, you know, parents who were struggling or had lost jobs or had lost family members to see what the community could do for those schools. And I think that that was a really healthy development. It sort of said students are not these kind of instrumental robotic academic producers. Like, we are in a care relationship with you and your needs extend beyond the academic. And so the question is, like, could we carry some of that through back into the schools that we have now? Could we leave behind leveling and tracking, deficit notions of students, and see students more holistically, use more restorative justice methods, and so forth. And then finally, just this like treat students like humans theme, which really came up through our data. Amplify, let students eat when they're hungry, go to bathroom when they need. There was a lot of outdoor learning during the pandemic, and a lot of the teachers in our sample said, we would really like to continue that. It's like 60 degrees in Boston here today, so take advantage of the positives of climate change while we can. Dress code, tasteless food, bathroom hall passes, getting up at 5:30 are things that we might hospice. Okay. Across these specifics, there were some broader themes. The first one is slowing down. I've been working with a number of different districts and schools this year, and I work with school leaders and district leaders who are feeling as if they have no time and every minute is scheduled and overburdened. And then I work with other folks whose situations are objectively quite similar, but whose stance is much more reflective and slower. There's more distributed leadership, and there's more of a sense of prioritization, which I'm going to come to next. I may be biased because Sarah and I wrote a book on deep learning, but you cannot do deep learning at the pace of, an emperor a week across the course of a year. Almost all valuable educational experiences students described to us in the deeper learning book were examples of working on a smaller number of things for a longer period of time. So our instinct this year has been all around urgency, and that has gotten us a lot of burnout, a lot of teachers leaving the profession, central office administrators covering for teachers in schools, really reducing the capacity of the system to really do anything. And what we want is a slower, more relational process. And how would we do that? A big part of it, I think, is to subtract. So you see Marie Kondo up there in the top left. On the top right is a book by Leidy Klotz about the virtues of subtraction across a whole variety of different spheres of human life. Turns out that people just have this instinct to add rather than subtract. Like if they come into a laboratory and you ask them to balance like a seesaw or a scale, and there's 6 Lego blocks on one side and 3 Lego blocks on the other side, people will add 3 Lego blocks to the one side rather than take 3 Lego blocks off the other side about 90% of the time. So like our instincts are always to add, but the results of adding is just incoherence and exhaustion, and we need to subtract and sort of pare back to what is essential. When I leave here in an hour, I'm going to coach 5th and 6th grade basketball. We have our first game this Saturday, and I went into yesterday with a list of about 100 things that I thought they would need before they played their first basketball game. And then I just reminded myself, okay, stop. Like, you're not going to get through these 100 things. You don't have 100 hours with these students, with these players before the game. Just like, what are the most important things? Let's just do those things and give those things enough time to run. That will build the right kind of spirit, and all the rest of it will follow from there. In a way, this isn't a new idea. I mean, if you look back at Sizer and Horse's Compromise, he spent a lot of time talking about less is more, and less is more, as I just said, is a big theme of our deeper learning book. So slow down, subtract. And then a third theme is connect. Connect with students, connect with adults. Really, the enemy of everything is transactional relationships, and the solution is what Buber called I-thou relationships where you really see the other person. And we need these across our system. We need them between students and teachers, and we also need them between teachers and administrators in a symmetrical way. And then from that comes the importance of listening. That really came out in our interviews, the anger teachers felt and not really being listened to over this past year, and the anger students felt and not being listened to. And so I think a good resource on listening is Shane Saffier's book, Listening Leadership. And Shane eloquently describes an approach to leadership which centers listening. Josh Glazer and I were asked to write a chapter about accountability, trust, and capacity in a cross-national volume. So we wrote the US chapter, and every author wrote about one nation and what their system looked like. And so when Josh and I had to step back and really think about our system as a whole, we thought, okay, really what we have is a high accountability, low trust, low capacity system. And a lot of our more specific problems, I think, come out of that. The fact that accountability, trust, and capacity are wildly out of balance, i.e. we are heavy on a blame culture. We have the most lawyers per capita in the world. And so there's a lot of, it's complicated because of the civil rights context and the desire to do well by all students, but still there has to be a way to do that in a way that builds rather than undermines trust. And the way to do that, I think, really starts with listening, and then listening again is a sort of parallel theme between students and teachers and between teachers and administrators. So if we think about what adults experience in their professional learning, which is the topic of learning forward as an organization, this is the kind of learning that they often experience, a sort of command and control learning where someone in charge has decided on some objectives, and then those objectives are going to be sort of like change is going to be driven. I love this phrase, driving change. Like, I don't know why leadership experts use this phrase, driving change, because who wants to be driven? It reminds me of being sort of like at the end of a harpoon or something. Batch processing, death by PowerPoint, an absence of trust. And this is really all part of like what you might think of as a 20th century mode of leadership, with its emphasis on gears and management by objectives and sort of Newtonian metaphors, i.e. there's like a puppeteer up here, and if you just get the right incentives, things will go in the direction you want. And I think what we want is a much more sort of garden-like organic set of metaphors, which say that adults, like kids, need competence, autonomy, belonging, and relatedness. You know, the Deci and Ryan competence, autonomy, and relatedness are sort of three core characteristics that human beings really need to function well. And they need some agency and choice over their learning. And if you do that, that gives opportunities for adults to experience the kind of learning that we want them to give students. And it also gives adults the kind of opportunity to live the kinds of lives that we're hoping that students will live. It's what Margaret Wheatley and Tim Delmo call the below the green line aspect of organizations. So they say that above the green line are things like structures and patterns and processes, all the things that appear in the organizational boxes. And below the green line are trust, relationships, healing, understanding, all those sorts of things. And they say most organizations go wrong because they over-attend to above the green line and not below the green line. And so this is more consistent with the 21st century mode of leadership, listing leadership, an ethic of care, emergence, and a culture of rigor and joy. All of this is grounded in a view that schools are complex systems, which I think is something we often forget. So here's a diagram from Gene Russell and Herman Wagner, and on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis is complexity. And they say that like the things that you can control are closest in time and the lowest in complexity. And then as you move out further to the right, as things are going further into the future, you can, and as things get more complex, you can guide them, but you can't control them. And then as you go further out to the right, you can nurture them, but you can't control and guide them. So I think we live in a world where we think we're living in that red box, the control box, when actually almost all the time we're living in the guide and nurture box. And that's the kind of world that we need to cultivate. All right, so we want to move from this, Doris Santoro's book, Demoralized, Why Teachers Leave the Profession They Love and How They Can Stay, to this, Thrive, Valerie Hannon and Amelia Peterson's book about how we could create a growing, purposeful set of activities for both students and adults. We want to move from this. We often talk as if we think of students or people who are vessels to be filled with this much English and this much math and this much science and this much social studies and so forth. When actually what we're really seeking is this, people who will be problem solvers, communicators, creative and critical thinkers, collaborators, entrepreneurs, self-directed lifelong learners, and contributing community and global citizens. And so if we were going to try to produce that second thing, we would need to allocate our time accordingly. A quote I really like from Margaret Wheatley: "There's always enough time for the right work." I always try to remember this quote when I get too busy. There's always enough time for the right work. If you devote your energy in the right directions, there's always enough time for those things, and that may require moving some other things. Around. I think we did this work over the summer. I think if you could imagine what it would have been like had the school system come back this year and taken seriously a lot of the things that I'm saying today, which are not things that I came up with, they're things that we called from leading practitioners and other folks out there. we would not have this angst around learning loss. We would have, we would put the needs of students in proportion, and we would see them holistically, and we would meet students where they are. And essentially, like, we've created a bunch of boxes which are getting in our way as we seek to make changes for students. All right. So if you want to learn more, on the left is this report that Justin and I authored, Healing Community and Humanity, How Students and Teachers Want to Reinvent Schools Post-COVID. So that will give you more details on our thoughts. There also are protocols in there, this Amplify Hospice Create activity, the tools we used for that, and which lots of schools that we worked with have used, are in there. And so essentially it's as simple as holding a meeting and asking people what they want to amplify, hospice, and create, and then putting together some teams, time-bounded for a short period of time to work on each of those things. In the middle, you can see Sarah and my book on deeper learning, if you want to learn more about how to create deeper, powerful learning experiences. And then on the right, a podcast that Rod Allen, who's superintendent in British Columbia, and I have been hosting, where we've been talking with leading practitioners this year, trying to understand how they're making sense of the year and how they are moving forward. All right, so I will stop there, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jal. It was really inspiring and exciting to hear about some of the possibilities in what I know is a really difficult time for so many of us. I want to let all the participants know that the slides from this presentation are available in the handouts section of your conference platform, so you have access to those. I also want to remind everybody that we are looking forward to your questions, so go ahead and put those in the chat box of the conference platform. So Jal, I want to start out by talking a little bit about your theory of your overall principles of Amplify, Hospice, and Create. And it strikes me that hospicing is probably the hardest part of those three things, or, you know, as you talked about Marie Kondoing. And then I was fascinated to see the research that suggests that that kind of subtraction is actually not wanting to do that kind of subtraction as a human instinct. So I'm curious, how do you encourage a system to hospice things that they've always done, especially when there's a lot of external pressure?
I mean, I think you're right that it is difficult, but I think there are sort of two parts to it. One part is identifying purpose or goals or vision or values. So with schools that I work, I always encourage them to make some sort of three-legged stool of three principles that really center the work that they're trying to accomplish at the school, towards which many of the goals, towards which many of the activities that they're doing could be connected. And then once you see like where it is you're going and why, critically not just what, but why, then it becomes more possible to look at the more specific things you're doing and thinking about like, okay, like we are doing this, but is it really contributing to our goal or not? And so essentially you have to make visible anything that's still there is there because somebody wants it because of some reason that is connected to something that they care about. So you got to sort of like raise up those things that you care about. And then you got to think about, okay, are there things that we care more about? Or are there different things that we could do that would allow us to accomplish more of the things that we care about and not lose some of the other things that we care about? So I agree with you that it's hard, but I think that it is doable.
There are a couple of related questions in the chat box, and I think you addressed some of the questions about helping educators to recognize what the ultimate goals are and connect. But there's a question from one of our participants who's also asking about the pressure from the external sources like the press and politicians and school boards, and how do we push back against this notion of getting back to normal? What's the kind of messaging or strategies that we can use when we know that educators and students are actually looking for something different than what the general public is pushing for?
Well, I think this is where a sort of more specific version of the Marie Kondo idea can be really helpful. So we wrote a little bit about this, and I can point I can point the audience to some of this, but basically, like, okay, so like in the curriculum, there are some things which are your kind of your must-haves, you know, like your Darwins and your Shakespeares and your Langston Hughes, like they're not going anywhere. But then there's a lot of things that are just kind of nice to have. So like, why are we keeping those things? And then there are some things which you need them, but you only really need a sort of strategic portion of them to do the next thing. So in other words, if a kid is doing 5th grade math and they miss some of 4th grade math, rather than like trying to reteach all of 4th grade math in 5th grade, why not, like when you get to the requisite skill in 5th grade, see whether there is some things that kids need that their pre-assessment is showing that they don't have, and then just teach those things like right then as you're about to do the 5th grade skill. Yang Zhao calls this just in time rather than just in case learning. So like just when you need it, the time to teach someone how to use a compass is when they're in the forest. Like that's when they're going to be interested in the compass lesson. So, you know, so I think there's that. And then there's a lot of things in the curriculum that just cycle. So like, you know, kids learn how to write an essay, which has a thesis statement and a topic sentence at the beginning of each paragraph, like every year from 4th grade till they graduate from high school. So like, you don't have to make that up. Like you're just going to do it again the next year in a slightly more sophisticated way. So I think the way to go to the external constituents is to say, what are the like most important things that we need our students to get? And we have a strategy for those things. So I think like we really like the learning loss question, we really want to break it down. Like if you're a 2nd grade student who struggles with reading and like 2019-20 or 2021 was the year that you would have gotten in-person support in reading, like I think you should get extra help now. Like it's important for everything that follows. But if you're like a 6th grade student and you miss some social studies, just like let it go. Just like, I love social studies. I majored in social studies in college, but like, just let it go and move on to the next thing and use the space to do something so you don't feel rushed and it's more interesting. So I think you want to sort of define a reachable, like an achievable value proposition to the external constituents. Because I think the other point to make to external constituents is like setting, you know, really, you know, highfalutin goals that no one can achieve and is just like leading all of our people to be stressed and burned out, like that serves no one's interest. And so the choices are not like we will magically catch all the kids up exactly where they would have been, or we're doing this other thing. The choices are like, let's define like a workable thing that we could actually do that's actually achievable, or we could define this like thing that we can't actually achieve anyway and do it not well in a way that makes everybody unhappy.
That makes a lot of sense. And when you talked about just-in-time learning rather than just-in-case learning, it reminds me of some of the conversations we're hearing about acceleration versus remediation, and the idea of making sure that, you know, you're continuing to move kids forward, but at the same time filling in the skills that they need, regardless of whether it was because of the pandemic that they are still lacking those skills.
Yeah.
And what about the role of school and district leaders? One of our participants noticed that some of the things that were in the hospice column of your table were things that might have been done to teachers and students by administrators. And this person wants to know, did you consider interviewing administrators or including them in your design charrettes?
We did include administrators in our design charrettes, though admittedly they were the kind of ecological administrators that I showed on my second slide, not the sort of gear-like administrators that were on our first slide. So I think that people who are in administrative roles and who think from a sort of facilitative growth, like growth mindset, but sort of like seeing human beings as people who need to grow, those are pretty much the most valuable people in the whole school system. So a lot of my heart is with people in those roles. If the question was like, was the question like, what should we do if we're a teacher and we have a top-down leader? Or was the question like, what could leaders do to facilitate some of these kinds of changes?
It's not entirely clear from the question. I know
Okay.
that some of it was a kind of methodological question, and I
Okay.
think there was another question along that similar theme of what do you do at the school level if you have a mandate from above? How do you empower people to do this kind of work?
So I think there's always this sort of bridging and buffering question. So like, to what degree can you say, to your people, like, hey, we're being asked to do these things from above, so we'll do some of them because we need to, but like really, like, this is the purpose that we are forging as a group, and this is what we're trying to accomplish, and this is how we're going to do it. So if you have the ability to do that, then do that. I think over time in school systems, if you're not in a turnaround situation and you're not in a situation where the test scores are in such a position that the school might be closed. So if you're not in that situation, I think for schools that are sort of above that threshold, I think school leaders and teachers have a real ability to define alternative value propositions. So in other words, if the parents are happy, if the kids are doing interesting and meaningful work, if there are some notable things that the school is doing, which can be highlighted in the local newspaper or things like that, then those things like gradually build political capital in the site leader. That's what you see in a lot of more, you can see it in any situation, but those things build political capital in the site leader. And then that in turn allows the site leader to resist some requirements from above because it's clear that the school is doing well. So in a sense, like in the long run, the more successful you are as a school by whatever metrics you've defined for yourself, the more space you will be able to win yourself from external administrators.
So in the same way that we encourage administrators to document for their own professional development and their own professional growth, what they're accomplishing, to do that at a school level and document what the rest of the staff and the students are accomplishing.
Yes, exactly.
Can you talk a little bit more about the design charrettes? It sounds really fascinating, and I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about the process and whether it's something that educators might be able to use either in professional learning or with students, even if they aren't necessarily trained researchers.
Sure. Charrette is a form that comes over from design, like usually like physical design, like how are we going to design like, a central square in a town or something like that. And it is a relatively short design sprint, could be a couple of hours, could be a day, but it's supposed to be a sort of confined period of time. It brings together a variety of different stakeholders, and it gives them some action-oriented questions. So in our case, because our leading practitioners came from all over and the final product was our report about their ideas, it was actually like a little less like a charrette than what some of your folks might do, because some of your folks might do it at an actual site where the site in turn has the authority to like make the changes that that follows. If you open up if you just Google my name and Justin Reich's name, it'll come up, Healing Humanity and Community, and there are the protocols we used and all of that in the back. But it really was as simple as asking people like, what do you see as your big priorities for next year? What are the values that underlie those priorities? What are some things that you want to amplify, hospice, and create? And then what are some tentpole ideas or metaphors that might organize some of the work that you're doing? Just because we thought that this is over the summer, and there were like a lot of those sort of like checklist type documents of like, here are 100 things you need to do before you open a school in COVID. And we were like, we don't need to contribute to that pile. what we're trying to do is give people some generative metaphors that they could use to move forward. And the Marie Kondo metaphor was the golden one, for example, that organized a lot of our other stuff. But we had some students, and I would definitely encourage folks to involve students in any design process. Students are always the most incisive observers and can see like what can and should be different.
I love that idea of tentpole ideas and metaphors. And I know that educators are great at coming up with those metaphors. So it might be really useful for people. When you and I spoke a few months ago for the learning professional, you talked about the importance of the timing of having these conversations about reinvention, and times during the year to do that and times during the year that you don't want to do that. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about that, especially now that we're back in school in person and back in the school year. What might the timing of this look like in a way that would actually be effective?
Well, it depends where in the year people have their professional learning time. If you are a school that has some professional learning time, like say the day, like January 2nd or 3rd, like right after we get back from the winter holidays, that might be a good time to just kind of take stock in a big picture way, like not try to do anything big immediately yet, but just be sort of like, hey, we're 45% of the way through the year, and we've been going about things this way, and like, how well is that working for you? I was doing a session with some superintendents not in my network, and a guy was a little reticent to come forward, and then eventually he did, and he said, you know, I started the year to like, I got everybody like fired up, and I was like, we're gonna do like 3 years of learning in one. And he's like, if you'd said this to me in September, like I wouldn't have heard anything you were saying, but now it's December and my people are leaving me and everybody is unhappy and burned out, and I need a different approach. And I was like, yeah. So I think in at this point in the year, and like traditionally, if you look at a curve of the year, it really goes, a lot of it goes with the weather. Like the worst months are the like January, February months. And so I think you're not trying to do massive things right now. You're just listening, and probably if you're a principal, just trying to take things off of teachers' plates and give them a little bit of space and time to regenerate themselves. And then I think as the weather changes, and as fingers crossed for about the 17th time, like if COVID starts to recede a little as the weather gets warmer again, then I think is the time to sort of say, okay, like we did a year and we've experienced the way we were doing it during COVID, and now we've experienced the way we did it when we tried to either go back to what we were doing pre-COVID, or we tried to do learning loss. Like, how is that working for us, and what might be some things we want to think about and try for next year? So I think you want to do your bigger seeding in the spring, and then you want to do your planning in the late spring or over the summer, you know, depending on when people have time, either right after school closes or right before school starts, depending on how people's schedules work, and then draw on that into next year. I think if there was anything good about the pandemic, it was the sense that we all slowed down a little bit and tried to remember what was most important in life in terms of relationships, connections to people, and taking care of students and their families, particularly poor students and their families holistically. And I think we should try to recapture some of that spirit.
There's a great question in the chat about the different types of schools and different situations that educators and students find themselves in. This person asked, I appreciate the distinction from turnaround or risk of closure situations, and I'm also curious how the recommendations differ in those scenarios. So perhaps you could speak first to whether there were differences in the findings that students and teachers made, and then also your own recommendations based on the research as a whole.
I mean, as far as we could tell, the higher poverty, it was sort of like a hierarchy of needs things. Like the higher poverty the students were, the more likely they were to talk about crumbling facilities, talk about tasteless food, talk about no breaks between classes, talk about sort of authoritarian dynamics with their teachers. And the more affluent students became, the more, they could they had the space to worry about things that were like a little bit less immediately pressing. I definitely have a concern that the way that the nation handled the pandemic in a very inequitable way. And then what that did was it meant that when we came back, the more affluent kids who on average had stronger internet connections and were more likely to have their own room in which to study or their own device to work on or all that sort of stuff, those were the kids who had their education disrupted the least. And thus, those are the kids who are having what is closer to a normal school year this year. And I think that the poorer the kids were, the more disrupted things were because of our inability to handle the pandemic in an equitable way. And then I think that that is increasing the level of pressure around learning loss and a sort of turning the screw approach to improvement. And so at some point we have to get off of that hamster wheel because teachers will relocate from, this has been going on for a long time, from less affluent to more affluent schools and so on. Until we create viable working conditions for teachers in poorer schools, it's really hard to create the kind of stability you need to build the right kinds of environments for students and so forth. So I don't know, I just sort of worry that everything is already inequitably distributed, and then the way that we respond to that inequity just kind of compounds that inequity.
There are a lot of things you touched on there that relate to an additional question that I think will be a great wrap-up question for us. You mentioned authoritarian dynamics, and you mentioned inequity. The comment in the chat talks about the fact that part of the change that's needed and that's going to take time is about a shift in power, and recommending that we pay more attention to the roles of students and families in creating humane schools. And I know that that's something that's near and dear to your heart and to your research. So could you talk a little bit about what the role of students and families could be and should be as we reinvent schools to make them more humane?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, can you think of any major social change in history that came about without some shift in power dynamics and without people claiming some power which is owed and due to them? I cannot. So I worry sometimes that we have a sort of inside the bubble technical conversation, but that once we but that things would change much more rapidly. And we've seen some of this through Black Lives Matter. The equity is an issue everywhere. And why is that? It's because of Black Lives Matter and the issues which gave rise to Black Lives Matter. And so that's an example of a social movement influencing things in a lot of different places. And yes, in some cases, the changes may be more performative than deep, which I've written some about, but you see people grappling with it in different places. So yes, I do think that shifts in power are key. I think that students are a critical constituency. If you think of all the people involved in schools, politicians, businesses, teachers, even parents, if you look through educational history, all of those groups have had a period where they have been at least one of the leading actors in school reform. So parents were organized more heavily in the 60s, businesses were more important in the 80s and 90s. The law has been more important in the sort of No Child Left Behind period. Teachers, while I think have been weakly professionalized and so unable to get the respect that they need to advocate for the things that actually would be good. They have had teachers unions which have advocated for things. But throughout all of this, students, there has not been a period where students have been organize to speak for their needs and desires. And ultimately, like the whole system is dependent upon their effort, and the whole system is for them. So I don't want to like put it on students, because it's really the responsibility of the adults to make the changes. But if there are any students watching this, like, you have the power. I mean, if students, we saw this with students protesting finals during the Vietnam War. Like, if students like withhold their effort, then no one else can do their work. So everybody's attention shifts quickly. So I think there are a lot of the things we could do are like technically within our reach. It's just a question of whether we would have the political will to do so.
That's a great reminder about having the political will. Thank you so much. This was really inspiring. I think you've given us lots of great ideas moving forward and get people re-energized. I'm going to hand that back over to Denise Glynn Borders to finish out our day.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Dr. Jal Mehta, for your insights on alternative value propositions and the need for more connection, relationships, and student autonomy. And a thank you also to all of our presenters, and sincere appreciation for your powerful messages today. I certainly learned a great deal from them, and I hope all of you did as well. And finally, thank you to our attendees for learning with us. We will see you again here tomorrow morning. Have a great evening.